If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary also get this episode ad-free with bonus content and early access. In today's bonus segment, I asked Rabbi Kenny Brander to tell me what things Israelis can learn from the American Jewish community and what Jews outside of Israel can learn from Israeli Orthodox society. His answers were important and enlightening, and we spoke about them for close to 20 minutes. That's available exclusively for paid Orthodox Conundrum Commentary subscribers. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's begin today's conversation with Rabbi Kenny Brander, entitled A Romantic Rendezvous with God, Young Jews After October 7th.
I, unfortunately, like so many other Rosh Yeshiva, spent a lot of time at Har Herzl. But I have to tell you, there was some times there that I really felt that Har Herzl became Har Sinai. I really felt a presence of God. I can't concretize that in, brisker terminology, but I really felt the presence of God. And I think that that's true for anyone. And I think that's also true what happened in Rafiach and what happened in Syria, what happened in Lebanon, that people actually saw the presence of God and they felt it. And therefore, they felt a need to connect to that.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Since October 7th, something unexpected has been unfolding among young Jews in Israel and, in different ways, across the diaspora. It doesn't look like the teshuva movements we've seen before. It's not a mass rush towards full mitzvah observance. It is not simply people becoming more religious in the way our communities usually define that word. Instead, we are seeing a deeper, more complicated spiritual shift. Young soldiers with tattoos and piercings are asking rabbis how to recite a blessing after surviving battle. Secular officers in Israel are making brachot when fallen soldiers are brought home. Crowds sing Ani Ma'amin after Hatikvah, and no one is shocked that faith has entered the public square. Some young people are wearing tzitzit, even if they're not shomer Shabbat. Others are joining public Kabbalat Shabbat davening, even if they head to the mall immediately afterwards. What ties all of this together is not nationalism alone and not ritual alone. It's a felt encounter with God. Rabbi Kenny Brander has described standing at Har Herzl during funerals and feeling that it had become Har Sinai. He spoke about soldiers in Rafiach, Lebanon, and Syria who experienced what they believed to be the divine presence and how that pushed them towards meaning rather than away from it. At the same time, this awakening is bottom-up, not top-down. It is being shaped by young people themselves and not imposed by institutions. And that raises big questions. Is this moment temporary, born of trauma, or the beginning of a lasting transformation? Can Judaism endure with deep belief but partial practice? And how should religious communities respond without judging, shaming, or trying to control what's emerging? And there's another layer as well. While many less observant Jews are moving closer to God, some observant Jews struggle to speak about God directly. We talk about Torah, we talk about halakha, and we talk about values. But sometimes God himself can feel strangely muted in our discourse. So are we witnessing a new chapter in Jewish faith, one that blurs old categories of religious and secular? Are we ready to listen to it? And what does it even mean? To explore all of this, I spoke with Rabbi Brander, who has spent the past 2 years visiting soldiers, students, and communities across Israel. We discussed miracles in war, the power of sacrifice, the meaning of mitzvot as expressions of love, and how we might create new vessels for an ancient tradition. And we'll get to that conversation in just a minute. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Kenneth Brander is president and Rosh HaYeshiva of Or Torah Stone, an international network of 32 institutions and programs across Israel and the world, committed to illuminating authentic Torah Judaism, rooted in halacha, yet eternally responsive to the challenges and opportunities of contemporary life. Before making Aliyah, he served as vice president for university and community life at Yeshiva University, taught at REITs, and was the inaugural David Minster Dean of the Center for the Jewish Future. He holds smicha from REITs, advanced ordination in medical ethics from Machon Pua, and then Chief Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, and a PhD in general philosophy and comparative literature. He previously served as senior rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue, leading its growth from 60 to over 600 families. Rabbi Kenny Brander, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I enjoy watching and listening to your podcast.
I appreciate that.
Very informative.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Brander, if we look back to a world before October 7th, 2023, perhaps we can talk a little bit about the way that we sorted Jews typically into different religious boxes and the reasons that to many of us that feels somewhat outdated or inadequate today.
Yeah, I do think that we did that a lot, but I do think it's totally outdated because I think if I can just elaborate on that with a few examples. I went to visit a group of our students, female students working in the intelligence component of the army at the Kiryah in Tel Aviv. And they made a comment to me that when they joined the army after sitting and learning for 2 years, their mothers said that, you should find someone, a chayal who, wears tzitzit, basically alluding they should basically get married while they're doing this. And she says to me, Harav, now everybody wears tzitzit, whether they're shomer Shabbos or whether they're not shomer Shabbos. The idea being that all of a sudden this, as you said, this wall between those who are formally observant and those who are not observant doesn't really exist. And we all saw that in a host of different. Let me just throw out 2 more examples of that.
And let me just make one thing clear to our listeners, in case there's any confusion. The fact that they're wearing tzitzit, as you said, does not mean that they're religious necessarily the way that's typically defined.
Correct. It means that they are wishing to have a romantic rendezvous with God, but it doesn't mean just because they're wearing tzitzit that they're keeping Shabbos, or for that matter, eating kosher. You had most recently, thank God, the end of the whole episode of having Chatufim, and when the body of our brave soldier Ron Gavili was recovered, the Ramatkal Ayal Zamir made a bracha of Shechianu. Ayal Zamir is not a observant, or at least he does not define himself as a shomer Shabbos Jew. And then the general in charge of the Southern District, Yaniv Osar, actually gave a Dvar Torah about Atzmot Yosef. Forget about the fact that all the chayalim that were involved with this, approximately 700, were singing Animam after Hatikvah. We're singing Animamin. Someone wrote that if this would have happened a few years ago, the focus in the media would have been, how can it be that the leaders of the army are using this moment to speak religion? Or what happened to our chayalim? But we're past that. We're in a totally different space where it's muvan me'elav that you would say, it's obvious that you would say ani mamin. It's obvious that you would make the bracha of Shechiyanu or mention Atzmot Yosef, since it happened at the Parsha, where we focused on the whole idea of Yosef's bones leaving Egypt. Or if I can just add one more example, which I think just brings the point home, and that is throughout this war, I had the privilege of visiting, thousands of our students and alumni, both in the North and the South. In one of my visits on the border in the North, a group of young men who are not students of ours came over to me and said, we just came out of Lebanon. Miraculous things happened. We know that there is some bracha we have to recite. We don't know what the bracha is. We don't know the structure of the bracha. Now, these two gentlemen, by definition of them asking the question, are spiritually connected. But I lost count about how many tattoos they had, which were just punctuated by the amount of body piercings between the tattoos. Yet when we made the Birchas HaGomel together, each one took the hand of the other, put it on their respective opposite heads as almost their formal kippah, and we made the bracha together with such kavanah. I hope my tefillot and Yom Kippur have the same kavanah. My point is really to take what you said, Scott, and take it to the next level, and that is we are living at a time where these dividing lines, thank God, don't exist like they used to. More and more young people and not so young people, both in Israel and outside of Israel, are playing a significant interest or a role in their spirituality. It might not be connected to their commitment to observance, but there is an idea of stronger religious and spiritual lives.
I'm very moved, Rabbi Brander, when you talk about that term, a romantic rendezvous with God. I think that's really an interesting way to look at it. So it sounds like you are saying this, I just want to confirm, this is not a matter of greater association with Klal Yisrael expressed through Am Yisrael's typical religious practice, not because of a connection to God, but just because we want to be connected with the practices that Jews do. You think it's actually a spiritual and religious connection to God, not so much nationalism.
I think it might be both. I think it might be, first of all, I think it is a spiritual connection to God after all that we've gone through, both again in Israel and outside of Israel, that there is this interest. And I think this is not the first time in Jewish history that we've seen this. But I also believe that it's a reason that that is an extension of people's selfless sacrifice on behalf of the people of Israel, where you have our young people, as you totally know, who have put their families on hold, have put their professions on hold, have put their education on hold, in order to serve the people of Israel. And they have come to a conclusion that they're part of a larger narrative. And that larger narrative suggests to them a stronger connection to God and a stronger connection to spirituality. It's why statistics have shown that 1 out of 3 young Jews, in other words, when I say young, I mean army age and slightly above, suggest that they become more spiritual since October 7th. 1 out of 4 have become more religious from the perspective of taking on more observance.
And you're speaking about 1 out of 3 and 1 out of 4 in Israel, I assume, not in the diaspora.
In Israel, but I think that the statistics, although they're slightly different, are outside of Israel also. In America, for example, there are statistics that have shown that there is a 23% greater affiliation with spirituality than there was in 2024 versus February of 2025. 55% are saying that spirituality has lost influence as opposed to what used to be 76%, and 44% have suggested that spirituality and religion have gained influence in their lives. In other words, you have both what we would call in Hebrew a sur me'rav aseh tov, people who say that they're not running away from the religious experience, and many more who are also saying they're engaging in the experience. And we don't need this just statistics. We can just see the fact that Jews after October 7th, the October 8th Jews in North America, in a period of 6 to 8 weeks, raised $1 billion. That is an unprecedented amount of money that was raised by people who heretofore didn't feel a connection to the Jewish people or to the Jewish experience. It doesn't mean that after they wrote a check for $150,000 that they koshered their homes or kept a Shabbos experience. It meant that they felt a need as part of their DNA as Jews to revisit their connection with Amcha, with the people, and with God.
I'd like to talk more about those people who gave $150,000 but didn't kosher their kitchen, or similarly, those soldiers who said they saw miracles and they wanted to know the text of Birkat HaGomel, and they had piercings all over, they had tattoos, etc., no kippot, as you mentioned. I'm curious from your perspective, Rabbi Brander, why is it that if they feel this increasing connection, they don't go all the way? Now, admittedly, we may be at the very beginning of a process, and we might see that this becomes a massive teshuva movement, and people do become mitzvah observant in great numbers. But it seems very often to me that it's likely that people are becoming more connected to God, more spiritual, without necessarily planning on increasing their mitzvah observance. So if you could diagnose what's going on, it's somewhat interesting to understand what's really happening. Exactly why is it that they don't want to go all the way, even though they're now what you might call ma'aminim, believing Jews?
So I think both statements you said are correct. They're not in conflict with each other. We don't know where this is going to lead. One thing we do know is if we are willing to embrace every person that is going on this journey, we have a better chance of them traveling longer on this journey. And all that we can guarantee is not their destination, but the values that we bring to escorting them through the journey. I saw this in Boca all the time. There were hundreds of families that became shomer Shabbos, not because we had a coercive conversation with them about Shabbat, but rather we spoke about the beauty. I think as people here in Israel are seeing the beauty of the experience and the willingness to sacrifice for it, I think more and more individuals are on that journey. And I'm not suggesting that I think they're all going to become, fully observant Jews, but I do believe that they are finding the Jewish experience to be a 3 or even 4-dimensional experience in their life, and not sure that's where they're going to take them. But I think that this is not the first time in Jewish history that we've seen this. There's actually an amazing sefer, an amazing book that's not well known, that was written by Yosef ben Chaim the Yavetz, called Orach Chaim, where he was one of the Jews that were expelled from Spain, where he writes that many Jews that were formally observant, in other words, they kept the mitzvot, but perhaps it was a robotic experience. When they were expelled from Spain, they walked away from the Jewish experience. And people that he calls in his vernacular Amei Haaretz, and those people who weren't fully observant, people who weren't connected, but they became ma'aminim, they became believers. They carried the mantle of Judaism even after they were expelled. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the power of faith to be able to celebrate a willingness to sacrifice for larger meta narratives and to be part of something greater. We're seeing a generation that's willing to do that. And I think it will transform the country in a whole bunch of ways, both in their education as well as perhaps in the way we think about creating a new government. That's probably in the next year or so. People are more spiritually enthused and more spiritually engaged.
It's very interesting when you use the expulsion from Spain as an example. As you mentioned, and we see the same thing throughout Jewish history when tragedies happen, most recently Nazi Germany, some people decide to chuck it all and other people become more religious. Looking at it from inside as a religious Jew, I sometimes would wonder why someone on the outside would become more religious when it seems that God abandoned us. I'm saying this from a secular perspective. If you had any belief in God, October 7th, if anything, should be proof for you that you were right all along. See, God's not taking care of us. It's interesting, and I'd like your input on why this might be happening, why the other phenomenon happens, where people actually grow closer to God despite his seeming abandonment.
I think one thing is that you have endless amount of stories of people who, while they were in battle, they actually felt God's presence. They felt God and their connection to God. You know, Or Torah Stone lost 25 students and an additional 39 first-degree relatives. In other words, children of faculty or fathers of students. And I, unfortunately, like so many other Rosh Yeshiva, spent a lot of time at Har Herzl. And as a Kohen, learned how to negotiate where to place myself. But I have to tell you, there were some times there that I really felt that Har Herzl became Har Sinai. I really felt a presence of God. I can't concretize that in brisker terminology, but in academic, intellectual terminology. But I really felt the presence of God. And I think that that's true for anyone. And I think that's also true what happened in Rafiach and what happened in Syria, what happened in Lebanon, that people actually saw the presence of God and they felt it. And therefore, they felt a need to connect to that. And I think there were other people who may not have seen that, but actually need as a way of acknowledging why they were willing to give up so much and why their friends were willing to give up so much, including leaving the battlefield with less limbs in which they went into the battlefield, that they're part of a larger narrative. And that's the way they make peace with the sacrifice that we have all made as a people in order to achieve these goals. So some of it could be like proactive seeing God, and some it could be the resolve of people's willingness to do this. It must only be defined by a commitment to faith, which is typified through our connection to the land, to the tradition, and to God.
Rabbi Brander, one thing which I think is very, very wonderful, this increased appreciation of divinity, perhaps we can say, in their lives, that doesn't lead to mitzvah observance completely. I think some people might actually be worried about this. They might say, is this going to lead to a new stream of Judaism, so to speak? For example, back in the United States, now things have changed over time, but conservative and Reform Judaism in many ways were considered a threat to the Orthodox establishment because these are taking people from our group and giving them new expressions of Judaism that people in Orthodoxy might have found more palatable. For example, back in the 50s and 60s, mixed seating in conservative synagogues was a major threat because people liked that. And it was something which drew people away from Orthodox rules. The question is now, are there people who are worried about what this might become? If this might become the beginning, I'm not going to call it a schism, but perhaps of something that starts off as a very nice phenomenon, a really important phenomenon. Nice is trite. I mean, something much more than that, but that becomes something which actually can be a challenge to religious Jews.
I don't think that what you're seeing here is people wanting to create an alternative spiritual experience and abandoning certain mitzvot in a proactive way, as you saw with the denominations that you articulated. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that people are acknowledging that they want to have a connection to God. And if they're going to go to a synagogue, to quote Ben Gurion, they're going to go to a Dati synagogue. Now, I don't think that those are the issues of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, which are more a North American issue, is the conversation that is happening anywhere in Israel now. I think that the conversation is, I want to connect to God. I'm not yet willing. I may never be willing to concretize that in a whole bunch of different ways. It might be sufficient for me to just acknowledge it. And that's not what our religious experience is. The Baal HaTanya says that when I celebrate mitzvot, I'm basically giving Kaviyachol a hug, like basically I'm giving God a hug. I'm connecting to God. It's a way of me increasing my love. Love is not just about an emotion. It needs to be concretized. The same way my love for my wife is not just an emotion, but it needs to be concretized. Where that will lead, I don't know. But I don't think it's leading to an alternative religious experience. It might not lead to what we would define as a complete religious experience, but it will definitely create a more religious, more spiritual environment in the state of Israel, which I think is good for all.
And I agree completely. I think one of the things that we have to stay away from is a typical insistence, maybe it's not conscious, but an insistence in Orthodox circles on almost a binary way of looking at religion, that either you're from or you're not from, to put it basically, that there are people who are religious and then there's everybody else. And the idea that there's a spectrum of connection to God, a spectrum of religiosity, we don't have to reject that as some sort of tovel v'sheretz biyado, that you're not doing it all the way, so it's like you're not doing anything at all. I think it's important that we dismiss that attitude. Do you agree?
100%. And I think that there's no better place than in Israel to see exactly what you said. Listen, it's interesting that the Balei Kabbalah called mitzvot itim. Itim means eitzot, suggestions. Now, that doesn't mean that the Balei Kabbalah thought that mitzvot weren't obligatory, but they were just trying to tell us what you just said, that mitzvot are there to enable us to have a strong, passionate relationship with God. Now, I don't know people's hearts. It could be someone who's having a robotic experience with Jewish observance, still has a passionate relationship with God. But I think what the Balei Kabbalah are trying to say is, let's understand the context of mitzvot. The context of mitzvot is the recognition of the fact that there is a medium through which we can create sacred moments in time with God. It could be the reason, and this is Reb Tzadok says this, it could be the reason that the only two commandments that are communicated, so to say, by the divine in a formal structure on Mount Sinai, on Har Sinai, was the idea of Nochi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God, you shouldn't have any other gods. And Reb Tzadok says, because those are the keys for all of our experience. We want to have a relationship with God. Everything else, to borrow Reb Tzadok's words, who's borrowing it from the Balei Kabbalah, are itim. They're suggestions of how to create that relationship. And you are reminding me of something that I haven't thought of until now. Simchat Torah, Rabbi Soloveitchik used to discuss this. Simchat Torah, the whole Sukkot, we encircle the Torah scrolls, highlighting the idea that the Torah scrolls are the articles in the center of our life. But on Simchat Torah, the Torah scrolls join the circle. And what happens is we dance around an open space, which, by the way, in Rabbi Soloveitchik's synagogue in Boston, that space was actually circled with like ropes, so people shouldn't go in there, because that space represents God. And on Simchat Torah, the Torah scrolls join the circle, and we dance around. We make a concrete relationship with God because Torah is there to help us make a concrete relationship with God. Oddly enough, this entire horrific experience that has transformed all of us as a community, as a society, as a people, and as individuals started on that day in which we encircle God. And I think that what we are seeing amongst Jews, both in Israel and outside of Israel, is this idea of we want to encircle God. Where that will lead, none of us know. Maybe we'll discuss this in a year or two from now on your amazing podcast. But for right now, we know that this is what's happening, and I think it should be celebrated.
And when we talk about encircling God, or a passionate relationship with God, as you said before, that actually leads to the flip side of the same coin, which is that at least in the modern or centrist Orthodox community in which we find ourselves, or in Israel, you might call it the religious Zionist world or the Dati Leumi world, at least for me, I often find discussion of God to be muted. Now, obviously there are exceptions. I don't mean among everybody, but there's a lot of talk about Torah, a lot of talk about mitzvot. Maybe there's even talk about bitachon ramuna, but talking about God himself seems to be something which is not that common. I've had interactions with people from other faiths, and God rolls off their tongues very, very easily. And it seems to me that the G word is not something which, at least I'm going to speak about the community I'm part of, the Dati Leumi or centrist Orthodox world, I don't think we find it that easy to talk about these things. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I wonder if that actually can be a problem, perhaps an impediment, that we have this young group of people who so want to talk about God. And then we have this group where they naturally should find themselves. And in this group, the talk is about Torah and mitzvot, but God, maybe not so much.
I actually think it's going to help the challenge that you mentioned, that often God is left out of the curriculum of Jewish studies. I think it's going to change it. I think it's going to compel us, for those who have a listening ear to what's happening on the street, and I mean that in a positive light, to make sure that God is more part of the curriculum. I do believe actually that God is more part of the curriculum in Israel, maybe because of the Bagriot, the finishing exams, and Machshavah Israel and philosophy, than it is in in the diaspora Orthodox community. But I do believe the fact that there's been so much conversation about God, not just in the stories or experiences that I shared with you, but even in the songs that are coming out of Israel about finding a relationship with God. I think that true good educators, which there are so many of, thank God, will listen to that language on the street and will internalize it within the classroom. And I definitely think the Yeshivot Hesder movements and the twin, so to say, the midrashot, are definitely representative of that, and the midrashot that speak more about God are the ones that actually are getting larger interests. And I think the Hesder Yeshivot that are speaking more about God are also getting more interest. And I think often we forget that even those, for lack of a better term, brisker institutions, we have to remind ourselves that even in Brisk, there was a struggle to find the centrality of God. Perhaps the best example, without going into it in any great depth, is the famous Rav Chaim that discusses what seems to be an alleged contradiction in the Rambam about two paradigms of kavana, of mindset, when it comes to tefillah, and the recognition of the fact that basically what is critical in the way Rav Chaim explains the Rambam, that ultimately for tefillah, for prayer to have any purpose to it, it must be an outlet to have a relationship with God. So I do believe that this will be one of the positive, among so many other outgrowths for all of our communities, that God is going to play a more central role in the conversations that we have.
I'll offer a mea culpa right now, Rabbi Brander, which is that I was strongly affected by Rab Soloveitchik's statement, in whatever context it was, that in some ways a person's relationship with God is very much his kodesh HaKodashim. It's a very private thing. It's so holy. And I don't want to vulgarize what Rab Soloveitchik said, but essentially I understand that to mean that talking too much about your innermost emotions, that does vulgarize the nature of those emotions. It almost makes them less holy. The same way that the Holy of Holies is a private place that only one person can go into. Only I can go into my heart and understand my true relationship with God. And that's true for everybody. The problem with that, not with the idea, but with the manifestation in my own life, is that it therefore leads to a reluctance to talk about God, not because I don't think about God, but because I've been trained, perhaps by myself, not to talk about him too much, to the degree that sometimes when I hear people publicly at a simcha, oh, I want to thank God, I think that's almost trite. That's not for the public, that's for you privately. And yet, from what you're saying now, and I can't disagree with you, it sounds like there are negative consequences to that kind of thinking, even if I think it's probably an actual truth.
There are three ideas rushing through my mind as you're saying this. First of all, you have to acknowledge the fact that Rabbi Soloveitchik and his family didn't talk about relationships in general. Forget about relationships with God. Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about that regarding his relationship with his premier and primary Rebbe, his father. Again, I don't think this is the time to go into that, but that's number one. So we have to understand the Soloveitchik family, who cared for their family in the most significant way. As someone who lived with Rabbi Soloveitchik for a few years, I saw how much he cared and how much his family cared for him. But they didn't talk about those type of things. That's number one. Number two is that Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his first pages of his book on prayer, acknowledges that a relationship with God, as you said, is not objective, but it's subjective, and and prayer also. Everybody has to find their own footing for that relationship. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that Rabbi Soloveitchik, again, I'm using Rabbi Soloveitchik because that's the point of departure of our conversation, says in many places, two that just jump out to me is in Ala Tshuva and Ubikashta Misham, I believe it's Ubikashta Misham, that Rabbi Soloveitchik says that he bemoans the fact that although he was a very good Melamed, a very good educator, and he was able to discuss serious halachic, intellectual, philosophical, that he often felt that he was not able to communicate passion of a relationship with God to his students, that he could discuss all issues of the avoda on Yom Kippur, but to be able to show his students how his grandfather was transposed and almost went into a time machine from where he lived to the service in the Beit HaMikdash when he was reciting the Musaf service on Yom Kippur, that he was not able to do that he failed to do that. So I think we have to recognize that Rabbi Soloveitchik, I think he was looking to make sure that people appreciated that emotional experience. And the final piece I would just say is that before Rabbi Soloveitchik had his preeminent Rav, namely his father, his first Rebbe was a Chabad Melamed who was supposed to teach him Talmud, but didn't, but taught him Tanya. And that's why sprinkled through all of Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings is really to the credit of this Melamed, who is Girsa Diankuta, his first foray into Torah was really the Tanya, and it became part and parcel of his Weltanschauung.
That's very important. I appreciate your mentioning all those ideas. Thank you. Now, related to what we're talking about, somewhat tangential, but I think it's important to mention, is a topic I discussed with Rav David Stav on this podcast about half a year ago or so. Even within the Dati Leumi community, I'm not speaking about people who are outside and are now gaining an appreciation of spirituality, but people who are within, many young people, it seems, have a tendency to be shomer Shabbos. They believe in God. They're religious. They may dress sanua, and they have a hard time keeping all the mitzvot. They may not call it having a hard time keeping all the mitzvot, but their commitment to all 613 mitzvot in the way that many of us grew up as part and parcel of what it means to be a religious Jew, that's lacking there. I'm coming from the other side now. I'm talking about among religious youth who they're not less religious, using that term, spiritual, believing than their parents, but they are less committed to practice. So given what we're talking about now, have you seen that as well? Is that a phenomenon that you've noticed?
The phenomenon with young people in general. I think that they're journeying through their life and through their, what's purposeful for them. And my hope is, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I have seen this. My hope is that as they become part of their own families and as they build and as they have their children and, set down stronger roots, I think they evolve in their level of observance. I don't concern myself so much with the fact that people speak about that there are religious Jews, young youth that walk away from some aspects of observance. Because I do believe two things. One is in Israel, that doesn't mean they're not going to marry Jewish and build a Jewish home. It just means maybe, I'm not sure what it means. But secondly, my experience have shown that once these young people settle down, we find that they still want a connection, and that connection reasserts itself. And that's why it's important that they're familiar with all the mitzvot. And maybe at some stage in their life, they weren't wearing tefillin all the time, but I believe they will come back there. And I think that that's also inherent in what we see with our young people in the army and in other places, where again, more and more of the experience, more and more of the slang has to do with Amunah. When a combat soldier has to fill up his canteens, the mifaked, the officer will check that the canteens are full. And the language used to mention that is they have to be as full as a kos of Havdalah. That's like amazing. Like that's the culture. There's just like it's just in the DNA of some of the most important institutions that we have, with the army being one of them. Or the fact that, there's always Kiddush said Friday night. I've had questions from students who are concerned about the fact that the mifaked makes Kiddush, and in some of these very elite units, the mifaked is a Druze or something else like that, and he's making Kiddush, so they just want to know the workaround because they don't want to disrespect the mifaked. But if they drink from his Kiddush, they're drinking before Kiddush. So, but I think that we need to give. We're a new people in a new land. We're an old people in a new land, but we need to give it some time. But I have great confidence that the emunah that we are seeing, that is bottom up. It's not a top down emunah, which, by the way, is some of the reasons why the top down forcing the Jewish experience is why some of the issues have happened. But a bottom-up Jewish experience may not be as, I don't want to say as comprehensive. I mean, to me, as fully organized, as fully developed, as fully shaped, as fully manicured. But I do believe that it will give rise to a different experience, and we will all be the beneficiaries of that experience, which is clearly evident on the street. Both on any street you walk on. I mean, you walk in a place like Eilat, okay, not exactly the most religious piece of the state of Israel. You will see people, on the boardwalk on Shabbos with the telephone in their pocket, and not because they're on Miluim and they have to answer, with a telephone in their pocket, walking around with a Sefer Tehillim. You will see individuals who are wearing tzitzit on Shabbos, and they are not dressed or observing Shabbos in a way consistent with what I'm familiar with people who wear tzitzit. We're just seeing it's a new, beautiful change of scenery, and I think we will be the beneficiaries of those experiences.
Well, let's talk about that bottom-up religiosity and our responsibility as people who may not be necessarily at the top, but within that community that they are not yet part of. And I don't know if we have a responsibility. I don't necessarily mean to be makari of them to full mitzvah observance, although that would be wonderful. But even just to make sure that this doesn't fizzle out as a phase that the state of Israel went through in the years after 2023. And then we look back in 2033 and say, oh, wasn't that nice how for a couple of years people were wearing tzitzis? I remember it fondly. Is there something that we in the religious world need to do to try to both make sure that it stays and that this connection with God and with Judaism, with Torah remains, and if possible, to even strengthen it?
I think obviously, I think there are things that we can do. And I also think that if we push too hard, we will in some ways compromise what has been achieved. But for example, one of my colleagues at Or Torah Stone is creating 360 groups, in other words, groups and communities like Tel Aviv, like Modi'in, like Yavna'el, like Haifa, and others, where all parts of the community are coming together, leaders of the community are coming together to discuss how there can be a more holistic interaction between all parts. That's not just about having, hine matov manaya, and like that we should be able to work together. It's about discussing how we can have a more serious, religious, holistic experience together. I think that that's a critically important thing to do. And I think there are other institutions like Sohar and others who are doing wonderful work also in that realm. And I think, again, we will be the beneficiaries of that if we create ways where, in parks around the country, there are Megillah experiences, which we've been doing in partnership with Sohar. Or we're seeing so many more people fast on Yom Kippur. The last study I saw was over 64% of Israeli society is fasting on Yom Kippur. the Shabbos experiences, and as more the idea that we're now seeing Kabbalat Shabbos experiences in public places, is maybe at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Shabbos is at 6. So there's still that lead time. Or maybe people are having that Shabbos experience and then they're going to the mall afterwards. But the bottom line is we are seeing more and more people. And if we can create more friendly, healthy, holistic, and I think uncompromising, in other words, they shouldn't be watered down, experiences, there will be people who will take from that and say, this speaks to me, and I want this to be part of my life, so I live a life that has more meaning and purpose.
So now, Rabbi Brander, I'd like to cast a bit of an accusing finger at our own community, the world of religious Zionism. And I'd like to cite something that I read recently in Rav Shagar. This is my own free translation from an essay, which was originally a speech he gave on Sukkot after the Second Lebanon War. And it's entitled Machloket Utzmicha. It appears in his book, Luchot V'Shivei Luchot. So this is my translation. He writes, "We complain about the left in Israel and accuse it of being responsible for the spiritual impoverishment and weakening of the endurance of the Israeli population. But we too, in the religious community, have a not insignificant portion of blame, as the alternative we've offered and continue to offer is of the type that cannot win their hearts and does not offer a meaningful response to that which the broader Israeli population is searching for or a response to their troubles." And this was 20 years ago, but I think it actually speaks very much to a real problem now. I'd like to see if you could comment on that, because I believe that he's right. I think this is not overly accusatory. I think it's correct. And we in the religious world are not necessarily offering an attractive alternative to people who otherwise might say, yeah, I joined, but I don't want to join with those people.
Oh, I agree with you. I think that what Rav Shagar said is as true 20 years ago as it is today. And I think we in the first of all, I don't like blaming anyone else for the challenges of religion in the state of Israel. We have to look at ourselves and see how we can improve. I think that we are too concerned about ourselves and about our own community to truly be honest with what we can do for others. And we have to change that, because we're part of a larger people. We're part of a larger family, and the family doesn't just connect with individuals who speak like them, who act like them, but should be concerned even about the sibling that looks and speaks in a different way, although doesn't mean that sibling's any less important or any less distinguished. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we do in order to make sure that the Jewish experience is something that everyone can connect to, and not ask ourselves. The word kiruv, I think, outreach is a dangerous word in Israel, because it sounds like we're interested in some form of hadata, fiyat datit, that we're interested in making them be just like us. We need to realize that we don't want them to be just like us. There are multiple tribes in the Jewish people. There are multiple paradigms in the Jewish people. And I think we have to be okay with the fact that people will celebrate their connection to God in different ways. Our goal should be, wherever you want to take this, if I can be a helpful hand, whether it's making sure that my synagogues are open to those who want to come on Yom Kippur or Shabbat and should have a place for them, whether it's making sure that we find a place, in the parks around the country for Megillah, so they don't have to go into a synagogue, whether it's making sure that I've seen so many more stores now that are not religious stores that sell everything from phones to sushi, having a stand for people who want to put on tefillin. Now, let's assume that out of the 100 people that walk into the store, maybe only one is putting on tefillin. But the 99 that saw the tefillin stand there are just, and it was done in a way where you're not asking, that before you buy the sushi that you have to put on tefillin. It's just saying that that there is an opportunity for people who want to be part of a narrative. I think the more we find ways to make sure that we welcome people without judgment and recognize that their and this is the hard part, that their spiritual experience, although it might not be a fully observant one, is just as holy and just as significant and should be celebrated. If we're willing to do that, if we're authentic, people will see that authenticity. The problem is we think that our responsibility is to create people just to be like us. Judaism is not looking for sculptors that just sculpt people in our own image. It's looking for gardeners who are willing to create ways for people to have a spiritual experience and to recognize and to validate that spiritual experience, irrespective of where that leads them. And parenthetically, although it might even be a mistake for me to say this, I think if we do the latter, we might find more people being more connected to our brand of Judaism, but I don't think that's the goal. Just the opposite. I wouldn't use the word kirov. I think our goal is to be brothers and sisters to all Jews in this country, and to find ways that they feel connected.
That's a beautiful vision. I'd like to take it a step further, also based on Rav Shagar in that same essay, and this might go in a direction that you don't like. I'd like to get your feedback on this. I'll openly say I think he's right. And he said in that same essay, I'm going to quote again from my own type of free translation, he talks about hitchadshu, which is a type of renewal, a renewal of our understanding of God. And this is what he writes. When faith is not renewed, God becomes an object, a cast metal God. Viewing faith as an obligation to think that various claims are accurate absorbs a physical dimension into faith itself. Religious language itself turns into objective language, belief that. He calls it emunah beh, but I think he means by that belief that as opposed to belief in. And thereby loses its spiritual nature and its ability to serve as a vessel of expressing the infinite. And what I think he means by this, at least part of what he means by this, is the importance of our constantly having new ways of thinking about God. The way that you mentioned Rav Tzadok, he had a brand new way of thinking about God. And Rav Kook had a brand new way of thinking about God. We sometimes have a tendency to, in the Dati Leumi community, quote Rav Kook and his understanding of God. And that's great. But Rav Kook died close to 100 years ago. We need new ways to further that same process. I don't mean that we have to move into heresy. God forbid, that's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about the possibility and the necessity of looking at God in a renewed way, in a brand new way, based on what came before, standing on the shoulders of giants, but adding our own take on it. Because I think it's not just that our Judaism needs to be more welcoming, yes, but it also has to be more intellectually vigorous in its understanding of the divine. What do you think of that?
I mean, first of all, let's just start off with the fact that Rav Shagar was a postmodernist and liked to, follow the Derrida perspective of deconstruction, and I think that there's a beautiful component to that. But it's exactly that point, and that is, I see that happening all over Israel. I see there being this postmodernist deconstruction of meta-narratives. Well, let's just take one, the idea of religious women serving in the IDF. I mean, 10 years ago, if you had 20% of the graduates of religious Zionist girls' schools serving in the army, that was a large amount. Now you have over 60%. And there are some individuals who will send notes to all the schools and say, you shouldn't let the young ladies serve in the IDF, and you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it. It's a bad thing, and etc. All that they're doing by sending those letters is actually increasing the amount of young ladies who want to serve in the IDF or want to go to the seminaries where they prepare them. So whether it's Migdal Oz or Midreshet Lindenbaum or any other place, I think that, sometimes I feel like I should call those rabbis up and say, you're serving as recruiters for us. I think that we need to recognize the fact that the Jewish experience is going through an evolutionary process. It doesn't mean we're deconstructing the roots of Torah and the roots of halacha. No, We're not doing that, and it's forbidden for us to do that. But we have to be willing to write the story on new pages, or on the parchments of our young people's hearts and not so young hearts in different ways. And whether we are happy about that or not happy, I'm personally happy about that. I think that's amazing. I think it's happening. I think this country is creating these new narratives and these new opportunities. The fact that for the first time in the history of the state of Israel, you have, albeit it's only two, women who are answering halachic questions in the IDF is a whole new, it's not a violation of halacha, but it's a whole new genre of opportunities to basically bring the spiritual capital of our people into the conversation, into one of the most important parts of our world, and that is the melting pot of Tzal. I think that we just need to recognize the fact that what Rav Kook did 100 years ago, what Rabbi Soloveitchik did, let's say 50 years ago, in redefining the Jewish experience by galvanizing all different types of philosophers to be able to do that, where, in Halachic Man, in the first, I don't know, 20 footnotes is a good part of the philosophers of 300-400 years, or more. I think that we need to do that. They've all done that. The Rambam did that. Everyone's doing that. They didn't sacrifice the halachic anchors or the spiritual anchors, but they allowed us to speak in a more modern context. And woe is to us if we don't create those opportunities, for two reasons. We'll lose people, including our own children, and we will not create those open portals for people who are searching for spirituality and wish to look at it in a different way. No one would have guessed that there would be as many kosher or Mahadran restaurants in Tel Aviv today, 10 years ago. No one would have guessed that the level of learning that is happening in Israel, which is far exceeds what has happened anywhere in the history of the Jewish people, even the second Beis Hamikdash. And a lot of that is happening because of heroes like Rav Shagar and others who created new ways for Torah to be accessible. Who would have ever thought that Binyanei HaUmah could be filled with no seats, standing room only, with women who have finished Shas? Who would have thought that? That's not violating halacha, just the opposite. It's allowing halacha to be able to expand its wings in unique ways. We don't have to just do that within the religious Zionist community. All the examples I gave you were more religious Zionist examples, but we have to do that in a whole bunch of different ways. And you know who gets that more than anyone else? Chabad. They get that. And that's why in most recent studies, especially in the United States, affiliation with Chabad is really the only affiliation that has really grown, because they accept you as you are. And if we can create, as Rav Shagar says, new flasks for their old tradition, I think we will just inspire ourselves. I'm inspired when I walk into a room and I have 30 women who finish Masechet Zvachim. Forget about if they're inspired. I'm talking about my inspiration. I'm inspired when I sit at a faculty meeting and there's 3 or 4 women who've gone through Shas 2 to 3 times. I'm like, that's like inspiring. And I think that we need to find ways of being proud of the journeys that those 2 guys I told you about up north, with their multiple body piercings and their tattoos, want to begin. And if we create venues for them, I think we will be inspired and they will be inspired.
Amen. That's a beautiful vision, which I agree with. But I'd like to mention the diaspora because we've been talking almost exclusively about what's happening in Israel. But you also mentioned towards the beginning of our conversation that in the diaspora, some of these same phenomena are taking place where people are feeling more connected with God, perhaps not in the classic religious way of orthodoxy, but they are getting that additional feeling of connection. What is happening there, first of all? And is there something that should be done there as well outside of Israel in order to further enhance this?
Well, I think that some of it is already starting to happen where, we're spending more time and more focus on college campuses than we have in the past. And I think that we're seeing that even in synagogues that are not part of the Orthodox community, there's a stronger outspoken commitment to Israel. And there have been serious rabbinic voices in the Reform and conservative communities that have been heroes, nothing less than heroes on behalf of the state of Israel. And that in itself, I think, is the beginning part of the journey. We have to applaud it. We have to be willing to engage in conversations and have friendships where our agenda is not to change them, but rather to applaud them and to recognize again, as we said earlier, that if we do that, I think that their capacity to play leadership roles in inspiring Jews around the diaspora will be more significant. And finally, I'm actually seeing that more and more of those who even are intermarried are interested in having a more religious experience. And I think we just need to applaud it and do what we can. I don't think we can give one particular way of dealing with it. I think we have to find multiple ways of dealing with it, including sending emissaries, including finding ways, including not only to be concerned about Aliyah, but be concerned about the Jewish experience in diaspora and trying to enhance it in ways that are appropriate for the diaspora experiences.
Then, Rabbi Brander, let me ask you a final question before we conclude today. You mentioned Aliyah. To what degree is it acceptable, do you think, for us to separate support for Israel? I do not mean its government. I mean Zionism as such, the idea that Israel should exist and is the center of the Jewish people, from Jewish religion for diaspora Jews who may feel, because of everything that's gone on, particularly in the media, they feel disenfranchised from Israel. They may want to have a Jewish connection, but their Jewish connection does not include Israel. Full disclosure, I am very against that. I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice by allowing anyone to disconnect them. What do you think?
I think that, it's a great question. First of all, part of the Jewish experience is Israel. I don't know how you sever them. That's like, basically saying that I want to embrace the whole person, but I want to cut off half their limbs. I mean, no matter what siddur you use, Jerusalem and Israel is a centerpiece of the siddur, irrespective of which siddur it is. That's number one. Number two is that when that happens, that people feel, and I've seen that happen. I have colleagues who've told me that people want to resign their membership from the synagogue because the Israeli flag is in there, but they love the rabbi so much that they'll pay the non-member dues for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they want to hear the rabbi, but they don't want to be part of a synagogue that has the Israeli flag in it. I wouldn't cast those people away. They want to pay the non-membership dues, b'vakasha. But I wouldn't try to change the ofi, the description or what our Jewish experience is all about. But I think that sometimes we strike when the iron's hot. Sometimes we have to strike when the iron's cold. I think that it would be important to find ways in which we talk to these individuals who want to bifurcate the Jewish experience and the Israel experience and find ways to re-engage them when the temperature cools down a little bit. I think that you'll see that people will be interested. And let me just add another piece to that, and that is we have 300 emissaries around the world. And these emissaries have actually gone through very difficult times for the reason that you just said. They're seeing anti-Semitism, not just by the non-Jewish community. They're actually seeing anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment by some of those who are in the Jewish community. We need to find ways to strengthen the tools that we give our rabbis, our educators, on how to deal with these issues of the state of Israel. We're not always good in articulating a vision for what Israel's all about. We need to improve that. But I would never try to sever the two. I think that that is not healthy. And not only do I think it's not healthy for the short term, I think it's not healthy for the long term. I don't think it's what Judaism is about. Forget about Israel. I don't think it's good for what the Jewish experience is about. And I think that when you see on television what was shown, which was in some ways so besmirching of our soldiers and what happened in Gaza, we all know stories of young men and young women who went into buildings and put their lives at risk to save Gazan babies, or to make sure they were fed, or to change diapers and things of that nature while they were under fire. We're all familiar with stories like that. We're all familiar with stories where youth were used by sharpshooters because they knew a chayal would go and help them, and then the sharpshooter took aim at the soldier. Unfortunately, those stories don't always get out. And that's a challenge. But as the temperature cools down, and please God, it will continue to cool down, I think we have to re-engage in that story and reevaluate how we communicate the story of Israel. But more and more people, I think, in the diaspora are looking for a relationship with God, and we have to make sure that relationship includes their connection to the state of Israel.
Okay, I agree completely, and I really appreciate your saying that. As always, Rabbi Brander, it's inspiring to talk with you, and I appreciate your spending time today. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.